In this demo now, we want to look at how we configure Intersite replication. So we're going to go back into the same tool we were using before and configure the links between sites. So let's go ahead and bring up Server Manager here and go back to our Tools menu. And once again, it's Active Directory Sites and Services where we go to actually configure this. So I'll go ahead and launch that tool. And the objective is to actually get into the Sites and Services tool and build out the configuration of when, how frequently these replication will occur between sites. So if you remember earlier, we created two sites, London and Toronto. And in each of those sites, we can see the actual servers. And then underneath those servers, we can see the NTDS settings. And this shows us the automatically generated. So Lund DC1 is replicating from Tor DC1, from the Toronto site, and it's a connection object. So I can right click and I can look at the properties of that. I can also replicate now. It's a way that I can force the replication to happen across this boundary, this site boundary. Remember, it happens within a few seconds if it's all within the same site. And we would see connection objects within the same site. Currently, we only have one domain controller in each site, so of course there aren't other connection objects to view at the moment. But I can look at the properties and see a bit of information in here. I can see the type of transport that this connection object is, IP versus SMTP. I can see the site. I can see the replicated naming contexts. Okay, I can even click change schedule, the schedule for the automatically generated. Okay, so there are settings, but as soon as I start to change a setting here, it is no longer automatically generated. And we actually want it to be automatically generated. That's the actual connection object. However, the connection object is simply following the rules that are defined within the Intersite transports. Okay, we would see the same thing in Toronto, except it'd be coming from the other way around. So we're replicating from Tor DC1 to LUN. If I expand Toronto DC1 here and I take a look at it, well, currently there are no items in this view, and that's because the KCC is probably still re-evaluating the connection objects here. So eventually we will see those in there. But let's take a look at the Intersite transports. The Intersite transport is going to be IP based. Yes, it is true you can create SMTP connectors, but for the most part, these systems are accessible via IP. And so we can see here the default IP site link. Okay, and that's just a name for it. And it's the connection object that connects. If we look at the properties of it, we can see that the sites that are in the link are London and Toronto. So let me actually cancel here for a second and let's give it a more descriptive name. Let's say that this is London to Toronto. So I've just changed the name, and typically our site links will want to have a descriptive name that describes what sites they're connecting. So the site link can be thought of almost like a configuration that must be adhered to between the sites. It's not the actual connection. The actual connection is down here under the NTDS settings, and it gets automatically generated. But the automatically generated connection has to adhere to these connection settings. So what is it about this connection between London and Toronto? If we look at the properties, this is where we can specify a cost and how often it replicates. So let's start there, replicate every 180 minutes. And let's change that to every 15 minutes. We can also change a schedule. If I click the change schedule button, this is where I could specify that replication is not available or replication is available. And then we would specify certain times that perhaps we want it to not be available. Okay, so if there was a certain time frame where even though it says replicate every 15 minutes, once we're in this time window, it stops replicating until we get out of the window again. So we can really control the bandwidth. We control when replication is happening. We could also add other sites to follow the rules of this link. If I were to do so, I would probably want to rename it to give it a more descriptive name, because as soon as I add a third site in there, it's no longer just London to Toronto. It's the rules connecting all three. So I'd want to change that. And then the last parameter there is the cost that we discussed. So it's an arbitrary value. The cost represents how much it arbitrarily costs the system to replicate across this link. So as we start to build a broader, more global replication, we can define, well, maybe from London to Toronto, it costs 100, and then from Toronto to Tokyo, it costs 500. So in total, to replicate from London to Tokyo, it's going to cost us a total of 600. Well, there might be another replication path, maybe going through Geneva, that costs less. And if it does, then replication will go that way in terms of how we get things out there. So these are some of the settings that relate to these components. And so that's the Intersite transport. One other setting to be aware of is, and it often gets missed because it's an actual right-click on the properties of this folder here, this folder called IP. If I right-click that and I go down to properties, we can see that we could come up from time to time, we might want to say to ignore all schedules. Or we could say here, bridge all site links. So this is where we can configure the site link bridging, which is where we connect multiple sites together to pass on through, where they can bypass the individual hops as necessary. So that can be found right in there by right-clicking the IP. So this is how we can configure our replication between sites. Again, using the Active Directory Sites and Services tool gives us the opportunity to go in there and really configure how we want things to replicate in our environment.